So aloha. Welcome everybody to the Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum Education Webinar Series, where we discover and investigate a range of topics, including aviation history, aeronautic innovation, World War II Pacific theater history, Pearl Harbor history, and much, much more. My name is William Spincola. I'm the Senior Manager for Education Programs here at the Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum, and I'll be your moderator today. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome. Our mission is, our museum is located on historic Ford Island in the middle of the Pearl Harbor estuary, right in the middle of Pearl Harbor on the island of Oahu in the Hawaiian Islands, USA. Our museum's mission is to steward the history of America's first aviation World War II battlefield. That is our Aquiliana, that is our mission, and to also teach the Pearl Harbor history and in our education programs to teach aeronautical science as well, and again, much, much more. Today's topic, ship killers. We're going to talk to you about the North American B-25 Mitchell medium bomber of the United States Army Air Forces. Many of you know this aircraft from the Doolittle raid from 1942, and maybe from the Mediterranean theater of World War II. But this aircraft's true contribution in World War II and its great impact and legacy of air combat is in the Southwest Pacific. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And the aircraft itself, the campaigns that it was involved in, the kind of missions and tactics it was used, and heroic, bigger-than-life individuals that made it all possible. We are joined by our guest today, acclaimed author and historian, a true expert in this subject, John Bruning. John, welcome to be with us. It's so good to see you again. I enjoy talking with you over the last few months and getting to know you. And I've read your books, so we're always proud to meet the author of the books. John is known for many histories of World War II aviation, including Indestructible, Ship Killers Pacific, Jungle Ace, Crimson Sky, 35 Days on Starvation Island, and much, much more. He's speaking to us today from a former air defense bunker in the Pacific Northwest. And John, welcome. Thank you for being with us.
Hey, thank you, Spin. It's great to be here. And yeah, the space is very unusual where I'm at. It was built in the 1950s. They called it a SAGE facility, and it's technically known as SAGE Facility DC-13. And then just recently, I found out what the call sign of the facility was. It was Ring Dove. So we were Ring Dove in the whole air defense circuit. So.
Wow. So, yeah. So that controlled like F-102s, F-106s, interceptors across the Northwest.
Yes. And it was, so the SAGE facilities were also set up to guide long-range anti-aircraft missiles called Bomarks to targets. Yeah. And the Bomarks had a range of about 480 miles and had nuclear payloads. So the whole idea being use an airburst nuke to knock a
to stop the nuke bomber
down.
Yeah. So that's what we grew up in, so I'm glad we didn't have to fight that war.
Yeah, no kidding. But to honor the Bomarks, that's the house drink. We built a bar here in the old control center, and so when you come to my bar, you'll have a Bomark. So there's one on the wall, so a photo of one.
Very good. Well, we'll kind of get into our topic right now. We have an image up. I hope everybody can see that. It's an iconic image. I know that people have seen that before in history. It's a modified B-25. It's in a low-level attack over a Japanese corvette or destroyer escort of some kind. And you see all kinds of splashes in the water. John, can you just tell us a little bit just about that photograph that we're looking at right there?
I'm pretty sure that is a 345th bomb group B-25 attacking one of the escorts that was covering a convoy in early 1945 that was crossing through the South China Sea. And it was hugging the coast. Pretty sure it was right off of Vietnam. And the 345th caught it, and some of the most incredible and iconic imagery of air to sea combat came out of that attack.
And you've seen that aircraft, it's got the bat out of hell, scary bat face. It's got, I think, quad 50s and maybe a 75 millimeter in the nose, and its bomb bay is open. There's a turret on it. It's just incredible. So about our B-25 really quickly, we all know it's North American Aviation. We know that North American fulfilled the Army Air Corps contract for a medium bomber in 1939. They were in competition with Martin's B-26. The Army Air Corps, Army Air Forces accepted both aircraft. The B-26 was a contemporary of the B-25. But our B-25's got some interesting things. In that photograph right there, we can see it has a non-contiguous chord, so it has a gull wing. There's versions A through J or H. John will tell us about that. North American built 9,816 of these aircraft over 5 years between their Inglewood, California plant and their Kansas City, Kansas plant. So that's a little bit about the aircraft that we know, but then it gets very special modifications here in the Southwest Pacific. So John, can you tell us a little bit about the theater, the Southwest Pacific, the Solomons, New Guinea, South China Sea in World War II in general, to kind of get us focused?
So the origin story of the Southwest Pacific Theater really starts in the Philippines in December of 1941 with MacArthur's Air Force, FEAF, Far Eastern Air Forces. And I'm sure most everybody knows, on December 8th, after a couple of hours after the Pearl Harbor attack, the Japanese hit Clark Field in the Philippines and several of the other fighter units, including fighter stations like Del Carmen, and virtually destroyed MacArthur's Air Force on the ground, wiped out most of the B-17s that had been sent to the Philippines as the anti-ship weaponry that the Air Force possessed, or the Army Air Force. It was a case study of forward deploying extremely complex aircraft into an area that didn't have the infrastructure to handle those planes. And it was a very costly decision. Those planes were very expensive. We didn't have a lot of B-17s in 1941. And the few that survived ended up operating out of an old pineapple plantation on Mindanao, or withdrew to Australia. And that force that first arrived in Darwin ultimately became part of the 5th Air Force. It was the 19th Bomb Group.
And the 5th Air Force, of course, has a very famous commander. And who is he?
Yes. Okay. So MacArthur went through a couple of Air Force commanders, starting with Bremerton. I'm Brereton. my sister-in-law lives in Bremerton. General Brereton left, went to the CBI and then to the Med, and the next commander, whose name escapes me at the moment, was killed in an accident. And nobody had any confidence that an Air Force commander, whoever they sent to MacArthur, was going to be able to work with them. MacArthur had a reputation for not really respecting the Army Air Force or its leadership, or what they could deliver. In fact, MacArthur always thought that the Army Air Force guys were always promising to over-deliver, and they would under-deliver, because they were trying to, make a separate Air Force and become their own service, which happened after the war. So there was a lot of discussion stateside over who to send. And they settled on General Kenney and asked MacArthur if Kenney was actually somebody he would accept. And MacArthur said, "Sure, I know Kenney. Bring him on." And Kenney was on the West Coast. He was the commander of the 4th Air Force at the time. And he was working on trying to solve the engineering issues with the early model P-38s, which were all in training along the West Coast. And they were losing P-38s every day to a variety of issues. So Kenney was trying to straighten all that out. He was a World War I veteran, and he was had shot a couple of airplanes down. He and his gunner. He was in an observation squadron. And had made a name for himself as a renegade, as a free thinker, and as a brilliant engineer during the interwar years. Whereas the service itself was obsessed with strategic bombing, Kenney loved the idea of tactical support and going down on the deck to deliver as much damage as they could at low altitude to enemy troops, to airfields, to tactical targets. And as a result, he commanded the 3rd Attack Group in Hawaii in the late 20s, early 30s, I think, before moving on. So he was a renegade. He was a rebel, and he came to the Southwest Pacific Theater in the summer of 42 and discovered a very demoralized force that had been hamstrung by bureaucracy, shortages. Aircraft arrived with missing parts or parts that were damaged. There weren't any instructions on how to assemble the created aircraft. It was a complete and total chaotic situation. And the very first thing he did was he set about completely realigning the logistical tail of the 5th Air Force to be a true combat support organization, which it had not been. And that was one of the reasons why one of the main characters in the B-25 story was running around robbing supply warehouses in Australia, which we'll get to in a minute.
It's in just a minute. So tell us why we get the idea of the P-38s, long range. Kenney understands them. They're perfect for the Pacific Theater. Now, why the B-25?
So the B-25 was one of 3 bombers that came to the 5th Air Force early on in the war. The other 2 were the A-20 Havoc, the light attack bomber, and the B-26, which equipped the 22nd Bomb Group. What they discovered was, actually through Pappy Gunn, was that the B-25 could be modified to handle a whole series of new mission types and tactical sets that nobody had even considered prior to the war. It had a longer range than the B-26. It was easier to fly off of austere airfields, ones that were, basically crushed coral or dirt and Marston matting. So eventually the 22nd Bomb Group was turned into a heavy bomb unit. They ended up with B-24s, and Kenney asked for more B-25 outfits. So he ended up with much of the 3rd Attack Group equipped with B-25s. They had one squadron that had A-20s, and then the 345th Bomb Group, the 38th Bomb Group were the big ones that became the commerce destroyers and changed the course of the war in the Southwest Pacific.
Commerce destroyers and ship killers. So that brings us to this Army Air Force officer who used to be a Navy chief petty officer, who used to be manager of an airline. Who's this man?
Okay, so this is PI Paul Irving Gunn, Pappy Gunn. He was the operations manager for Philippine Airlines right at the start of the war. He had been a 20-year Navy pilot, had been a flying chief, and was very well respected. He'd flown off of the Lexington. He'd been part of the search for Amelia Earhart. He'd flown off the USS Langley, the first aircraft carrier. He had a very, very colorful career in the Navy.
This is as a Navy NCO, as a non-commissioned officer in the Navy.
Yes, yeah, he was part of the flying chief. What is it? Naval and Aviation pilots, the NAP program. Right. So he retires just a few years before World War II, and he gets an offer to come to Manila to help stand up Philippine Airlines. So he does that, and he picks the aircraft for Philippine Airlines to fly, and he bought a couple of Beech Stagger wings, and then this aircraft, which was the Beech 18. His wife Polly selected the colors that Philippine Airlines would fly, that bright red. And ultimately, before the war, they had four.
Here's Polly.
That's Polly and PI after the war.
Pretty lady.
Before Pearl Harbor, Pappy was able to take delivery of 4 Beech 18s, and they were all painted red like this. And at the start of the war, he moved all of the Beech 18s into a makeshift airfield out of a Chinese cemetery just outside of Manila. And he was able to conceal them there from the Japanese and keep them safe from air attack. And shortly after he did that, MacArthur essentially drafted everybody from Philippine Airlines into Far Eastern Air Forces. So Pappy's airline became the first part of 5th Air Force's Air Transport Command.
Wow.
And
I could add that our museum, Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum, is very close to acquiring a Beech 18. So
that's great to hear. Yeah, I actually put the Beech 18 on the cover of
there you go. There it is.
Indestructible, because this airplane, when I started seeing the reports coming from observer stations and surviving documents from the Philippines campaign in December of 41, saw a red twin-engine aircraft, I realized that Pappy didn't have time to repaint the airplanes. So here he is flying around in a combat zone where the Japanese have complete command of the air in a bright red airplane with no armament, no armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks. And he got shot up over Cebu and barely survived during one run, crash landed back in Manila. Wing was torn off in the crash. The Philippine Airlines guys actually repaired that aircraft and reattached the wing with baling wire and flew it to the Dutch East Indies to get some of the people out. And eventually the Japanese destroyed it on the ground in the Dutch East Indies. Another one, Pappy was ordered to take the FIF staff, senior FIF staff, down to Australia in what would become the nucleus of the 5th Air Force command staff. And that happened just before Christmas of 1941. And Pappy told his family, who his kids and his wife were living in Manila, I've got to be gone for a couple of days, then I'm coming back, I'm getting you, and we're going to get you out of here. And he left and it took longer than he had anticipated to get down to Darwin. And as soon as he got to Darwin, he heard the news that Manila had been declared an open city and his family was in all likelihood captured by the Japanese. So he attempted to go back to the Philippines in one of the Beech 18s that he had gotten out, which he modified with massive internal fuel tanks to get him to Mindanao. So he filled the passenger compartment with 55-gallon drums and had a crew member with him who was switching the pump from one drum to another in order to get nonstop from Darwin to Mindanao, and it worked, except when he got there, he ran into a Japanese float plane that shot him down, and he ended up in a bean field, I think. He escaped and evaded, got to General Sharp's troops on Mindanao, and he was flown out on a B-17. And at that point,
was he Army Air Force at the time? Had General MacArthur, by Supreme Commander orders, put him in the Army now at this point?
Yeah,
so
that happened a lot.
He's Army Air Force now.
The U.S. forces in the Philippines, the Philo-American Army, was so short of officers and people with expertise that and the severity of the emergency was such that they actually on the spot commissioned civilians left and right. In fact, I'm writing a book now about a civilian miner, a gold miner named James Cushing, who was commissioned a first lieutenant because he had engineering experience, and he ended up doing most of the demolition in Cebu City just before the Japanese invaded. It created havoc after the war because there were all these civilians saying, "Hey, I was commissioned a first lieutenant.
Right.
I was commissioned."
Especially those who were left behind with the guerrilla forces.
Yes, 100%.
A great deal of honor and pride there, but a lot of confusion with administrative paperwork. But Pappy's
100%.
wife and his children, what happens to them?
So while Pappy was trying to get them out, they were interned with the other American and Western civilians in Santo Tomas University. So they stayed there until January of 1945, when they were ultimately rescued by a flying column of, I think, 1st Cav and 37th ID.
I believe so. I believe that's correct. Yeah.
And then, so Pappy, he was kind of bouncing around as a captain. There was so much chaos and nothing was organized in Australia that he attached himself to the third attack group and just went in and finagled a role. And he went back to the Philippines in a B-25, during the Royce raid, which was the Royce raid was actually eclipsed by the Doolittle raid. It happened at the same time, but they actually were able to get a squadron of B-25s up from Australia to Mindanao to attack Japanese targets in the Philippines while operating out of Del Monte and a couple of other secret jungle strips in the heart of Mindanao just before the fall of the Philippines. And Pappy was one of the pilots who piloted one of the B-25s. There's an apocryphal story, and there is some debate over whether or not these airplanes were stolen, but
commandeered under tactical emergency conditions.
Yes, these B-25s were actually supposed to go to the Dutch, and they were sitting, not being used. And I believe the administrative paperwork was already being processed to transfer them over to the 3rd Attack Group, but it was taking a heck of a long time. And Pappy Gunn was not a guy who had any level of patience. So he gathered a bunch of people together from the 3rd Attack. They flew down and climbed into those B-25s and took them home. And the Dutch were like, "Wait a minute, what?" Now they
so
did
we have
get
this.
later.
We have this excellent pilot, this charismatic leader, and mission-focused commander. Now, how does he contribute now to 5th Air Force? What role is he going to play?
So while he's with the 3rd Attack Group, they hit some shipping during the Royce raid. And one of the things that he realized in these attacks was bombing shipping from high altitude with a Norden bomb site, which is what the Army Air Force was doing in the Philippines and also already in the Southwest Pacific with the B-17s they had. Was incredibly inaccurate. They were just killing fish. So he started thinking about other ways to hit a ship target. And there was, at the same time, percolating around the B-17 units, the idea of going down low and trying to skip bombs across the wave tops into the sides of ships. And one of the B-17 units that came in the fall of 1942 and joined Kenney had actually started playing with those tactics. Now, before that unit arrived, Pappy had decided that this was probably the way to go. Low altitude attacks were the way to hit ships.
For our folks who don't understand, the aircraft would approach the ship at very low altitude above the surface of the ocean, drop the bomb in such a way that it would skip across the surface of the waves, like you would skip a stone in a pond or the beach. And then it would stay low to the water and hit the ship at the waterline and then detonate with devastating effect. So,
And as Pappy played with these tactics and experimented with this idea, he realized that in order to pull this off, the aircraft needed to be able to suppress the Japanese anti-aircraft gunners on these ships. So that's where he got the idea of, hey, let's stick as many 50 caliber machine guns in the nose of our aircraft as we could. And he started with the third attack group's A-20s. And through the early part of the summer of 42, he was able to modify the A-20s with an additional quad 50 caliber setup in the nose, just like this B-25 here. And they used those A-20s to strafe the Japanese troops that were approaching Port Moresby overland on the Kokoda Trail.
So the A-20 is a Douglas aircraft. It's a high performance, good performing bomber, but it's a light bomber. Am I correct?
It's a light bomber, and he knew he couldn't put any more weight in the nose of that airplane. So in order to get the things that he needed, first off, there was considerable pushback over what he was doing. You're modifying U.S. Army equipment. You're not staying within the technical specifications of the aircraft. There was all sorts of problems. In fact, Pappy was always right on the verge of being court-martialed. And because of before Kenney showed up, the supply and logistics command was run in such a way that they didn't want to give anything to anybody. So the line units couldn't even get replacement parts. And the reason being was they wanted to establish depots that had plenty of things. They wanted to, build the warehouse stock up instead of getting it out to the people who needed it. So Pappy began raiding these warehouses with a band of pirates from the third attack group, and he would go in with either a pair of 45s or a Thompson submachine gun and appropriate what he needed. Other times he would do midnight requisitions where they'd go sneak into boneyards, aircraft boneyards around Australia, and pull the 50 caliber machine guns out, which is how they got the 50s into these Dutch aircraft that they had stolen. So the whole story is a little crazy. I mean, it's hard to believe all this happened.
Well, at some point it comes to Kenney's attention, and then these things are working, right? I mean,
Kenney saves Pappy's butt on many, many occasions. And the first time this happened was in late August, early September of 1942. They meet, and Pappy explains what he's doing. He's actually tearing into this B-25 and adding 8 guns to it, 4 in the nose and then the side packs.
That's got to be good, right? That's got to be good.
And Kenney asked him, well, what about the center of gravity? And Pappy goes, oh, we threw that out a long time ago.
Yeah.
They actually, playing around with it, the first modification was so nose heavy that Pappy nearly crashed it. There was a lot of talk around Australia that this was insane behavior, and they were calling the project Pappy's Folly, which is why his airplane was named Pappy's Folly. But he figured out the weight distribution issue by moving the side packs, the cheek guns, behind the cockpit. So that restabilized the aircraft and didn't make it so dangerous to fly. So they were able to create 8-gunned strafers. And Kenney, who loved the idea of low-level attack, thought this was a great idea and gave Pappy the green light to keep doing it. And Pappy eventually modified an entire squadron, and then they built a depot in Australia to just run these B-25Ds through and turn them into what Kenney would later call commerce destroyers. And the
commerce destroyers, and they would just paint in the glass house canopy in the nose. They just paint it over.
They would, there was all sorts of variations on what they were doing, but the bottom line was 8 guns in the nose, and then they paired that with what the B-17 guys had been playing around with that fall, which was the low-level skip bombing attacks. And the B-7, if you could imagine a B-17 20 or 30 feet off the water going flat out, throttles open, by moonlight, attacking Japanese shipping in one of their most defended harbors. This is what these guys in the 5th Air Force were doing in the fall and winter
That's
of
epic. Just
42.
epic. Now, when did they, two questions then come to mind. When did they put like the 75 millimeter in the nose as well? And when did North Americans start making the modifications in England?
So that starts happening after the Battle of Bismarck Sea, which was sort of the acid test of the whole concept. The 3rd attack and the 38th Bomb Group also got the initial commerce destroyers, and they practiced the skip bombing techniques against a wreck in Port Moresby's harbor. So they constantly were running these missions where they were working out how to skip the bombs most effectively into the side of a target. And they discovered they needed to have delayed fuses, so they had to have the fuses made. They went through a whole series of training, and it was like a learning curve. And then the acid test came in early March of 1943 when the Japanese were bound and determined to recapture the initiative in New Guinea. And the idea was to deliver an entire infantry division to Lae, which was their primary air base on Papua New Guinea in the eastern part of New Guinea. Now, the Japanese had just gone through a horrific defeat at Guadalcanal, and then also MacArthur's forces had defeated most of the Japanese troops in Papua New Guinea at a place called Buna.
Yeah.
So the deal with that, though, was almost 60% of the Allied troops that were engaged in clearing Buna of the Japanese became either battle casualties, medical casualties, or psychiatric casualties. And it was a stunning level of carnage. And the idea, and they were fighting against Japanese troops who were starving, who were using the decaying bodies of their own comrades as firing positions. They were short of ammunition. They didn't have artillery. They had machine guns and knee mortars and light infantry weapons, and still they were able to inflict that level of damage on the Allies.
So determined enemy, professional, and just going to be hard to dislodge.
Exactly. And the idea, I mean, you want to send shockwaves through MacArthur's headquarters in March of 43, tell him that an entire Japanese infantry division, reinforced with artillery, with armor, was coming to New Guinea. And he gave Kenney an ultimatum. You have got to destroy this force before it gets to Lae. And the bombers, the 5th Air Force bombers, had been trying to interdict these convoys and had failed. There had been another one in January that had gotten through. So this time Kenney was like, okay, we're going to go after them. We're going to try the skip bombing techniques. We're going to go in on the deck. We're going to have some element bombing conventionally just to hedge our bets. So the B-17s were going to be going in at 10,000 feet. Some of the B-25s that hadn't been modified were going to go in at 6 to 8, and they were going to be escorted by the venerable P-38.
And here you see in this photo a skip bomb attack on, it looks like a coastal freighter. So you've got one B-25s coming off target. Maybe both are coming off target. I see the bombs exploding.
Yeah. Yep.
Can you tell where that might be?
Yeah, that's somewhere on the coast of the Netherlands, New Guinea. This took place a little bit after Bismarck Sea, and but it's a really good illustration of the timing required for this type of attack, because if the trail B-25 was too close to his leader, he could actually get caught in the blast of the bomb. So they had to work the timing out too, and actually they had that down from all the training they did on that wreck by the time the Battle of Bismarck Sea comes around. And the the Strafer B-25s and Australian bow fighters and Beauforts went in and they destroyed this entire convoy. They took out every transport. They sank a number of the destroyers that were escorting it, and they put about 8,000 Japanese troops in the water. And then with the 50 caliber machine guns in the nose, they strafed the Japanese troops in the water. And the reason being, there was fear that they would be picked up by the surviving destroyers and steamed to Leh anyway, which is what happened. Some of them actually did get to Leh, but by the time they got to Leh, they were shocked, traumatized, without weapons, without supplies, and they ultimately, most of them, starved to death because of the interdiction that the Fifth Air Force was doing subsequent.
That cannot be
Bismarck Sea.
overestimated. I mean, Fifth Air Force's victory at Bismarck Sea was epic in military history. So an Air Force defeated a field army as it was deploying to battle and removed it from the battle completely. I mean, that's just
there's nothing like it in the history of World War II. There's really nothing. No other victory was this one-sided.
In this image and other, we see all these incredible tail gunner views of the lead aircraft with the wingman in trail. Can you explain how that came about?
So that was Pappy's innovation. He wanted he was always a photographer. He always had lots of cameras and home movie cameras that he would use. So he began tinkering and putting 16 millimeter cameras and mounting them in the tail so that they could get some sort of strike intelligence from what the guys were hitting and doing, so they could also see, if their bombs missed or hit. So those photos that you see on the screen right now all came out of those cameras, and sometimes they had still cameras, but usually they had 16 or 35 millimeter
this must
cameras.
be, I think, later in the war, but you see a parachute retarded bomb coming down on the railroad. This is in Formosa, I'm assuming.
Yes, yeah, that happened a little bit later. The earlier photo of the ship strike, that was Bloody Tuesday, the attack on, that one right there. So if you Spin, can you go back to that photo for a sec? So you see the B-25 coming off target here, center left, right? 38th Bomb Group. In the background, you see all the smoke?
Yes.
Okay, so
the whole coast seems to be on fire.
Yes, part of the plan of this particular attack on Rabaul, which took place on November 1st, 1943, was to use an element from the 345th Bomb Group to lay a smoke screen across the coast of Simpson Harbor to blind the Japanese anti-aircraft gunners ashore, so that the third attack and the 38th Bomb Group could go in and strike the shipping there without having to worry about getting hit from the land side. And it's one of the very, very few times that was actually attempted in combat, but it was a favorite Kenney tactic prior to the war.
And here we see looks like a sunk freighter right here.
Yeah, this is a later convoy in 1944 that the B-25s were able to catch just off the New Guinea coast, and they completely wiped it out. It was like a mini version of Bismarck Sea. I had a dear friend who watched that attack, and he told me that the B-25s went in practically wingtip to wingtip. He was on escort duty that day, so he was above them, watching them, and they just went through the Japanese convoys. Ships were going down, rolling over, and within seconds, he said, the sea was just carpeted with shipwrecked survivors from those vessels that they'd been able to get out and get into the water.
And is this a New Guinea coast or China coast?
So this is Ormoc, Leyte in the Philippines.
Yeah,
When the
this is
Japanese Yeah, when the Japanese tried to reinforce Leyte after MacArthur landed on the
Right.
island in October of 44, they sent two convoys to resupply convoys and reinforcement convoys to Ormoc on the opposite side of the island. And the ship killers went in after them. One of them in November caught the 5th Air Force completely by surprise,
Right.
also caught the Navy by surprise, and they were able to slip in. But the one in
And they got
December
a
was,
division ashore is what they did. Yeah.
yeah.
My uncle had to
The,
fight them.
yeah, the one in December they hit really hard, and I don't know if your audience knows who Perry Dahl is, but
Yes.
Perry Dahl is he's the last surviving ace from the 5th Air Force
Yes.
P-38 pilot.
He's a big friend, Ohana of the museum.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah, this is the mission that he was shot down on. He was escorting this B-25 that's in this photo. That was his mission that day, and that's how he ended up parachuting through the anti-aircraft fire and landing just off from those ships. So yeah, if you ever get a chance and you're in Southern California, the Planes of Fame Museum in Chino has Perry Dahl's has their P-38 in Perry Dahl's markings. And these are shots of escorts being destroyed in the South China Sea. This is sort of the culmination of 2 years of low altitude attacks. And by the time they got here, like this photo right here, you could see the Japanese never really figured out how to defend this. They would try to turn away from the bombers. They would sometimes turn into them, but the B-25s were almost always able to get at least a partial broadside during their attacks on them. And they evolved the skip bombing techniques to something that they called masthead attacks, where they would release the bombs just before they got to the side of the ship. And this is one of those cases here. So they weren't actually trying to skip the bomb across the water. They were just trying to release it and have it fly right into the side of the vessel. And if you look at this photo here, look at the top left, you can actually see spent 50 caliber shell casings flying out of the tail gun position of the B-25 that took this shot.
You see right below it, you see a B-25 coming into attack, and then obviously in the right hand corner you see another one coming off. So that's 3 aircraft on just one strike.
It's yeah, you can see the other one coming in, and notice he's coming in broadside. The initial Japanese response to this attack was technique was they thought they were under attack by torpedo bombers, so they would turn away or turn into the attack. That was the standard tactic that they used all through the war anyway to deal with this. And what it did was it masked their anti-aircraft guns. They couldn't deploy all of their guns against the B-25s, and yet the B-25s could rake the ships stem to stern with their 50 cal fire. So it was
with the skip bomb attack. Did the B-25s use a special bomb sight for the skip bomb, and how did they sight to 50 cals into 75 millimeter?
That's a really good question. Spin, I'm not sure exactly the details of it, because early on they literally just painted a cross on the canopy, where they had through practice figured out where to shoot.
That was the sweet spot.
Yeah. Later,
I think Huey pilots did that for rocket attacks in Vietnam.
You're kidding me.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So I think things just kind of come around, right?
Yeah, we have such amazing people. I mean, can you imagine doing that? Now, later they had installed gun sights, but the actual release technique and the skip bombing, I don't think they ever had an actual means to accurately judge that. I don't think they had a sight. I think that was something the pilots just had to learn, and it was a very, very tricky thing to do. And as a result, when this became something that went into the production line and they started modifying the B-25s coming out of Kansas City and then modifying, actually after Bismarck Sea, Pappy actually went back to the United States on orders to help Dutch Kindleberger set up the production line to make this, something that the
In Inglewood
field
and
mods.
in Kansas City. Interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah. So instead of actually building the modifications into the production lines, they created actual modification centers. So they would come out as your average B-25J or H or G or whatever, and then the ones that were going to the South Pacific would go to mod centers and be modified based on the designs that Pappy Gunn had worked out at Wright-Patterson with the Air Force engineers prior to his return to the Southwest Pacific in the summer of '43. And these are more ship strike photos from the South China Sea. And I'm like, that last convoy that they hit was, it created some of the most iconic combat imagery ever captured, for sure.
Incredible.
Yeah.
And here it looks like they're striking for an amphibious landing, or is there a ship there you think they're hitting?
This may have actually been a barge hunt, and they were taking out barges. I think you can see some of them along the coast there. Yeah. They were used for all sorts of different operations besides the ship killing. And this is a fine example right here. Pappy was able to figure out how to extend the range of the B-25 by pulling out the belly gun, the belly turret, installing an extra fuel tank there, and then installing a Tokyo tank in part of the Bombay. And with that modification, they could go from airfields in Papua New Guinea all the way to WWII, which was where the Japanese Army Air Force was reconstituting. And they had sent literally hundreds of factory fresh aircraft to the 5 airfields at WWII, thinking that they were out of range of Allied bombers, especially the strafers and the mediums. So there was a sense of complacency that was completely unwarranted on the part of the Japanese. These fields were also very austere. They didn't have much in the way of force protection. They didn't have much in the way of revetments. And so they just lined the aircraft up wingtip to wingtip in 1943. And
that's crazy.
Yes.
There you go.
In August.
And Pappy came up, or Kenney, somebody came with these cluster munitions.
Yes, that was Kenney's design pre-war, and the Air Force had just stuck those things in a warehouse. And when he came to the 5th Air Force, he ordered those things sent to him. And in August of '43, they hit these airfields and caught the Japanese completely by surprise and destroyed the bulk of the Japanese Army Air Force on the ground in a series of low altitude strafer and parafrag attacks that man right there, Pappy Gunn, made possible. And the Japanese Army Air Force units that were in that area suffered somewhere along the lines of 90 to 95% casualties among their personnel after they lost their aircraft, because they had no way to get home to Japan. They ended up in the jungle with the troops and starved to death. That photo is from I think I said November 1st. It's actually November 2nd, 1943. That was Bloody Tuesday. You see the cruisers in the background. They had just come back from the
cruiser there.
Yeah, from the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay, where they attempted a night engagement to stop the Marine landing on the 1st of November at Bougainville in the Solomons. And that's a 3rd Attack Group aircraft coming off target.
There's the closer picture of that scene.
Yes.
Okay.
And that's the Haguro in Simpson Harbor on November 2nd. And if you look over to the right, that merchant ship that's on fire, I'm pretty sure was either hit by Dick Ellis or Jock Hennebrey. The two guys, Ellis became the vice commander of the Air Force at the end of his career in the 70s. He was the youngest squadron commander in the 5th Air Force at the time. And Jock Hennebrey was the skipper of, or the commander of the Third Attack Group. And I mean, you could see the destruction that these aircraft were able
Oh,
to cause.
absolutely. And I just want to make sure we saw the bombers lined up. That's just so you were saying, we talked before we went on air that the Japanese felt that this airfield was a cantonment rare area, that it was a strategic base and not in the combat zone.
Yeah, it was a huge miscalculation.
Incredible.
Dreadful. Yeah.
Incredible. Let's see here. And that's another, I think that's probably getting ready for an amphibious attack.
Yeah.
Those Dutch ones that we talked about. That's kind of crazy.
Yeah. So those Dutch aircraft were the ones that were delivered to the Dutch Air Force as compensation for the ones that the Third Attack Group appropriated. That was the deal that was being worked out. Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. We see more ship attacks. I'm trying to make sure we can see everything here. But here we go. You were talking about North American Aviation. So this photo is when this is after the war, correct?
Yeah. So you see Pappy at left there with Polly in the middle, and then the head of North American Aviation, Dutch Kindleberger, on the right in the double breasted suit. You see Pappy's arm is in a sling. He was very badly wounded coming ashore with elements of the 1st Cavalry Division at Leyte in October of 1944. He was part of one of the initial waves, and he was tasked by General Kenney personally to establish and maintain the airfield at Tacloban, which became the only usable strip in the Philippines for many months, because the other areas where they thought they could build airfields turned out to be so boggy, the fields were useless during the rainy season. So Tacloban was very important. And he'd only been there a week, and he was actually wounded in a Japanese surprise attack. He was hit by a phosphorus bomb, took shrapnel in an arm, never fully recovered from the wound. He was evacuated out, got to a hospital in Australia, and it was months and months and months before they figured out exactly what had happened to his arm. But every time music was played, anytime there was a loud noise outside, it would cause him absolute agony. His nerves would just rebel. And eventually a doctor figured out that he still had a piece of phosphorus shrapnel in his arm that was impacting his nerves. And it took forever to figure that out. And by the time that it happened, he lost much of the use of his arm. But he survived.
On a positive note, 1st Cavalry Division rescued the folks at the internment camp, as we see Polly right there.
Yeah. So when I wrote Indestructible, the best part of this was there was a happy ending, because the family was in fact reunited. I hate to give the ending away, but they did reunite at the hospital in Australia. And
then also by the time of Leyte, the campaign on Leyte, and then the invasion of Luzon, 5th Air Force and 13th Air Force came under the new Far East Air Force. Is that correct?
Yeah. So Kenney was now commander of 2 air forces. One of his most trusted officers, General Whitehead, took over. Whitehead took over the 13th. Yeah. And so they operated in concert. A lot of times the 13th by this point would be tasked with suppressing the Japanese bases that had been left behind to die on the vine. And the 5th Air Force kind of remained the strike force for MacArthur. But there was interplay and interactions there.
And I think it's important for folks to understand that throughout this entire epic of World War II in the Southwest Pacific and the Philippines, MacArthur is using Army forces to capture airfields, so Kenney's Air Force then can project power forward to the next objective. Just the opposite of what's going on in Europe, and that's just unique to World War II. You know, it's like the Army ground forces setting the conditions for Air Force to go in to do operational and strategic attack versus the opposite. So that's just very unique.
Such an excellent point, Spin, because you look at the way MacArthur hopped along the northern coast of New Guinea through this campaign 43-44 to get back to the Philippines. They always did it, except for one operation at Hollandia, under the air umbrella of the P-38s. So they could only make the next jump as far as the range of the P-38s would allow them to go. So they had air cover for the invasion force. And by doing this, MacArthur executed what became probably the greatest unknown campaign of World War II. I mean, the economy of force he used is remarkable, but even more remarkable is the number of Japanese troops that they were able to cut off and neutralize.
In New Guinea, like 60,000 troops, I think, just on New Guinea alone.
No, it was 250,000. It was as large a force as was cut off at Stalingrad. Now, everybody knows about Stalingrad, right?
You don't know about New Guinea.
250,000. Of those, 11,000 survived the war to get home. So you'd be hard
they were like
pressed.
planting mushrooms in the forest to survive. They were completely cut off.
Oh yeah, and I have all the studies and legal documents surrounding the discovery that the Japanese were actually eating the local indigenous peoples because they were so desperate. And actually, there was cannibalism among the Japanese troops. They were also eating American and Australian captives and prisoners of war. It was truly horrific.
John Toland talked about that in his epic history, A Rising Sun. We have a couple of good questions here. So we talked earlier in 42, 5th Air Force B-17s, while they still had them, we're trying to do the skip bombing, and just what an incredible sight that must have been. Did they ever try with the B-24 Liberator, which they had groups of?
Actually, that's a great question, because I interviewed a pilot who'd been in the 90th Bomb Group, which was the Jolly Rogers, one of the 5th Air Force heavy bomber units. He was there very early on in the war, and they did fly a couple of those low altitude missions, but the B-24 was very unsuited for it. It just didn't have the kind of maneuverability that the B-17 did. And actually, the B-17 ops stopped as soon as they had the strafer squadrons sorted out and trained in the the B-25 groups. So it was only a very short period where they toyed with that idea. The B-26 groups, there were a couple of them in North Africa that experimented with skip bombing tactics and techniques as well. And yet that only lasted from January to March of 43, and then they went back to medium bombing. So it was really very unique and specific to the Pacific. The 11th Air Force's B-25 units, however, did continue those low altitude missions all through the end of the war. The
11th, for folks, the 11th Air Force was based in CBI, so they're like in Burma or in India, and they're on the China coast. Is that correct?
That was the 14th, but they were using these techniques as well. The 11th was actually up in Alaska.
And they were in the Aleutians, yes.
Yeah. So they were in the Aleutians, and they were running missions. They stopped the convoy coming into Attu using skip bombing techniques, and then they skip bombed Japanese shipping in the Kurile Islands all through 44 and 45 with those B-25s. So
did the B-25 raiders on any of these missions ever use napalm on either a ship target or a ground target?
It's a really good question. I don't think they would use it on ships. They may have used napalm in the Philippines with the B-25s. There were several cases where, especially around in the Cagayan Valley in the spring of 1945, there was a dam that the Japanese were defending, and they had an entire division dug in around this dam. It was called the Ipoh Dam. And the 5th Air Force promised MacArthur that they would soften that area up. And Kenney went to the 5th Air Force fighter units and said, "You guys are going in. We're going to blanket the Cagayan Valley with napalm." And Gerald Johnson, who at the time was the commander of the 49th Fighter Group, pulled his guys together and said, "We're going in wingtip to wingtip, wave after wave." And that's exactly what they did. And they basically turned that valley into a sea of flames, and they virtually destroyed that division. I actually wrote an article on my website about that attack and how the prisoners that the Army captured characterized what those attacks did to that division. It's just horrific. But they used hundreds of P-47s and P-38s, and they may have even had a P-51 group at that point too.
Again, you see some incredible innovation for the operational and tactical conditions here in the Southwest Pacific. So we're using aircraft in unconventional manners of attack, using new weapons, new ordnance. So skip bombing, cluster munitions, parachute retarded bombs, napalm, phosphorus. We know they use phosphorus. One of our questions here is: were the bombs themselves, were the skip bombing of ships, were the bombs themselves modified in some way?
They had the delayed fuse. They may have played with the fins a little bit, trying to figure out the best way to stabilize them in flight. But for the most part, they were standard 500-pound general purpose bombs. Yeah, with the delayed fuse.
See, another question: how did they aim the 70? We talked about this before. How they aim the 75 millimeter in the nose? I think that just like an X on the canopy?
So Pappy was a big supporter of the 75. He came back from the North American factories and his time at Wright-Patterson with the engineers, the Army Air Force's official engineers, convinced that the new 75 millimeter gunned B-25 was the wave of the future. And the guys in the 5th Air Force were very skeptical of this. So Pappy flew some combat missions as a 43-year-old man. He was specifically told by Kenney not to go into combat, but he did so anyway. And at the end of July of 1943, he was on a mission with the 3rd Attack Group where they ran into 2 Japanese destroyers off the coast of Cape Gloucester. And Pappy scored a direct hit with the 75 on one of the destroyers' smokestacks. He came off the target and then shot up a Japanese transport and put a 75 millimeter round right next to an aircraft transport that had just landed with some VIPs, and sent the VIPs scattering and wounded and killed a bunch of the guys around the transport plane. And then he came back around and made more passes on the tin cans. The photographs from that mission are absolutely extraordinary.
I think the most incredible World War II air combat pictures are from 5th Air Force, be they low level over the jungle bombing airfields or like this image here. Do we know how many, this might be an unfair question to ask. Do we know how many ships, or at least tonnage wise, that Kenney's Air Forces were able to destroy?
Well, I don't know that off the top of my head, Spin. But,
I do know from my own studies and education that the Navy subs get the most tonnage, but just a couple ticks behind them. I mean, just within 100 tons is the air interdiction. So it's a huge amount. And when you consider that the maneuver is not possible without the logistics over water to get these Army forces to where they need to go. This is just incredible. And they're also interdicting supplies. Not only are they interdicting the movement of troops within theater of operation, but they're sinking cargo ships going back to Japan as well. Certainly the 14th Air Force on the China coast is. So it's a combined effort.
100%.
So when World War II is over, what happens to Pappy? What does he do?
So Pappy stayed in the Philippines.
Polly went home with his wife, and she stays there with him.
He was always paranoid that something would happen and Polly would get caught up in another conflict.
Well,
So the
not
family
wanting your
went.
wife to be interned again is a good.
Yes, he. So Polly went home, and the family stayed in Pensacola for a while, which is where Polly was from, and then Pappy went back to stand the business back up, and ultimately he and his son Nat ended up as essentially aerial mercenaries operating in support of the rebels during the Indonesian Revolution. They were in Laos, they were in Vietnam when the French were there. And ultimately, in 1957, Pappy was killed in a plane crash in the Philippines in a twin beach.
Wow.
Yeah.
And then go on.
Nat came home. He ran his own air transport service stateside for years and years and years. The amazing thing was he never had a pilot's license. His dad taught him to fly out in the Philippines, and he ran an entire air transport service, flew without any official paperwork, flew Beech 18s.
Did Nat ever wind up with Air America, working airline for the CIA?
So there was some overlap for sure. I don't know if he specifically worked for Air America, but he definitely did operations for the agency. And then when he came home, he settled in Texas in a little town outside of Gun Barrel City. And Nat became one of my closest friends. When I worked on Indestructible, we talked every morning for four or 5 years until COVID. And he was just a fantastic human being. And to his dying day, he loved his dad with, I mean, his dad was just such a magnetic, incredible figure. He engendered considerable loyalty and love among those who knew him. He also, with his rebellious spirit, got in a lot of trouble. Kept getting in trouble over and over and over again.
What about Polly? She's survived the war, back to Pensacola.
There's a beautiful moment that Nat told me about it. I'm going to get choked up. I love this moment. It's one of the most special things I've ever been able to write about. So when Polly and Pappy met at a church picnic, Polly was actually the young woman that Pappy's best friend wanted to court. And immediately that didn't work because Polly and Pappy ended up with this insane, immediate, lifelong connection. Well, years and years later, like 20 years after Pappy had died, Polly was living with Nat, her son Nat, in Missouri. And this friend of the family came to visit and sat in Nat's kitchen and proposed to Polly and said, "I'm single, you're widowed, I have loved you my entire life. I would like to make you my wife." And Polly's response was, "I can't possibly marry you. I had the love of my life." Can you imagine?
That's just incredible.
So, yeah,
Absolutely incredible. Well, I think
I'm just so blessed to be able
on.
to write about people like this, just amazing, remarkable human beings.
And it all wasn't that long ago. I think that's what's important. Wasn't that long ago. And so long as their deeds and memories are part of our heart, they'll never die.
For sure.
Well, John, thank you so much. It's been an outstanding hour with you. I really enjoyed talking story. We learned a lot today. I think some of the lessons, operational lessons from Southwest Pacific are applicable to our fighting forces today.
Oh yeah.
And then the personal story is just absolutely incredible. We could probably just go all day on that. Absolutely. I would like to invite everybody to come to visit us here at the Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum. And John, you come by and we'll sit out on the lanai and talk stories some more about all this. I look forward to seeing you soon.
That sounds good. All
Right.
right. Hey,
So
thank you very much.
Thank you for everyone for being with us. Remember to come and visit us. We'll have a few more webinars before the end of this calendar year. Your support, coming to the museum, participating in these webinars, make our education program possible. Thank you so much. So mahalo nui loa for being with us. We'll see you next time. A hui ho.